Chapter 22, Internal Transport. We're going to begin by studying our circulatory system. And William Harvey was an English physician, and in 1628 he clearly demonstrated the circulation of blood. So we've known about the circulation of blood within the body for actually nearly 400 years. The blood, or the circulatory system that carries blood, transports it throughout the body, and as an adult, we have about 5 liters of blood that gets circulated around, and it circulates completely through our body once a minute. So our heart is busy moving it around our body. Now, what are the functions of the blood? Well, the blood is a marvelous, like a red river, and it transports oxygen, which we've learned in a previous chapter. It transports nutrients from that have been absorbed from like the small intestine and moved throughout the body. It circulates hormones that have been produced in different parts of the body so that they affect the appropriate cells. The blood also transports carbon dioxide to the lungs for expiration, and then it also circulates the wastes that have been gathered from different parts of the body and brings them to the kidneys for excretion. The blood does play a very important role in homeostasis. If you remember that term from first semester, it means steady state, and it is very important in helping all of our bodies stay in that perfect state of being able to function at its very best. Now, the blood contents, if you were to allow a portion of blood that's been drawn from the body to set for a period of time, you would notice that it would separate like it kind of shows here in this test tube. The top part would be kind of a straw-colored liquid, and at the bottom would be a reddish portion of it. The top part is called the blood plasma, and it's the liquid part of our blood, and then the bottom, and which makes up about 55% of the blood, and then the bottom is the solid part, and it's about 45% of our blood, and that's where you're going to find the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the blood plates, and things like that. But our blood is about 90% water, so water is a very important part of maintaining a healthy body. Now, blood plasma, it's a portion, as we saw in the previous slide, is a portion of the blood, and it's 90% water, and it is very important in the other things that are found within it. That remaining 10% are proteins, dissolved gases, minerals, nutrients, hormones, vitamins, and waste make up that other 10% of the blood. Now, blood proteins perform many functions, including like maintaining blood volume. It helps in blood clotting. It transports different substances, and then also it's very important in our immunity, which as we have learned is very important at this time that we're in. And the composition of the plasma varies somewhat, even in healthy persons. So not every person is exactly identical to the next. Now, in the blood solids, we have the red blood cells, we have white blood cells, and we have blood platelets. And this is that 45% of the blood volume that we talked about. Uh, the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells, uh, we'll learn a little bit more about. They're the one that carry oxygen primarily. The leukocytes are the white blood cells. They're the ones for fighting disease. And then we have the blood platelets, are called thrombocytes, and they're the ones that help our blood to clot, to reduce bleeding and promote healing. Now, each of the components in the blood have very different shapes and function, and they all originate from a single type of stem cell that is able to develop into all these different kinds of blood cells. So you can see that from this cytoblast, you can get, as you look down on the bottom, you have the erythrocytes, and then you have this middle section here where they're all different kinds of leukocytes. So those different names like basophil, eosinophil, neutrophil are all parts of leukocytes. And then we have the lymphocytes, and the monocytes are also leukocytes. And then we have thrombocytes way at the right, bottom right, and those are the ones for blood clotting. The hemocytoblasts are located in the bone marrow, and they're responsible for certain growth factors that affect their genes. Now, the red blood cells, this would be if you were to take a sample of blood and they would make it into what they call a blood smear. They smear a thin layer of blood on a slide and then add some stain to the slide. And under, as it says down here in the bottom left, at 1,000 magnification, these would, the big round looking red donut looking things are the red blood cells, and then the two larger ones with the big purplish blobs inside of it are going to be leukocytes, and then those little tiny purple dots are going to be our blood platelets. So you can see red blood cells are by far the most in number. Okay, and they're on the average, humans, it's about 4.5 to 6 million per cubic millimeter. Remember what a millimeter is. It's very tiny. And there's about 4.5 to 6 million of red blood cells in one of those little, so a millimeter is smaller than a drop. Now, erythrocytes are often called red blood cells. They're produced in the bone marrow. And early in their life cycle, erythrocytes contain a nucleus, but they don't have very much hemoglobin. And then as they mature, and shortly before they move into the bloodstream, the amount of hemoglobin increases, and the nucleus decreases in size and gets squeezed out. So eventually the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells, will lack a nucleus. And so obviously at this point, this structure is really no longer a true cell. It can't reproduce itself. So to get new ones, you'd have to go back to the original source. So erythrocytes contain a few cellular structures, and as we said, they don't reproduce themselves. They may be more properly described as a membrane-bound biconcave structure filled with hemoglobin. So if they have a membrane around the outside, biconcave, concave means to be pushed in. So think of if you had, while they were making a donut, before they cut the hole in the center, if you would just take your fingers and pinch it together in the middle, not poking a hole through, but just pinching them together in the middle. That's kind of the shape that red blood cells have. So that's that biconcave that we were talking about. And the reason why for this shape is that it provides the greatest possible surface area for the volume of the cell. So in other words, it increases surface area so they can get more oxygen in and out in a shorter amount of time. Now, erythrocytes are unable to move by themselves. They don't move around inside the blood. They're only carried along by the current of the blood. So thus it's important that the heart beat and push the red blood cells around the body. Now, when the oxygen is bound loosely to the iron-containing heme group in the hemoglobin, if you remember that from a previous chapter, the oxyhemoglobin is kind of going to be a bright red color. So red, the blood is bright red because of the oxygen that's being carried by the hemoglobin in the form of oxyhemoglobin. So after oxygen is released in other body cells, at other parts of your body, the blood becomes more of like a dull purplish red, and that's what, when it comes back to our heart and any vessels that are close to the skin, it gives us kind of that bluish color, but actually it's still red. Now, if you lack iron in your diet, you can't make enough hemoglobin, and the result of this decrease in red blood cells and hemoglobin is called anemia. And one of its characteristics is that you lack energy. And so because certain B vitamins also aid in the proper formation of hemoglobin, B vitamin deficiency is also a cause of anemia. So different things can cause anemia, but it's just not carrying enough oxygen throughout the body. Now, in a developing fetus, erythrocytes are formed primarily by the spleen and the liver and the red bone marrow. So these are the three places where red blood cells can be formed: the spleen, the liver, and the red blood cells. The average lifespan of erythrocyte is about 90 to 120 days. So that's and then specialized cells in the liver and spleen will take out these old and damaged red blood cells and break them down kind of like into their original materials, and then most of the remains of this destroyed erythrocytes are recycled, and they're going to be used to form new erythrocytes. Now, the next kind of cells that you find inside of the blood are called leukocytes, and they're the two bigger circles that you see here with the purplish blobs inside of it. Those are the leukocytes. Okay, they're called white blood cells. Okay, here they look purplish, but that's because they've been stained. Otherwise, they're pretty clear looking. And in that same cubic millimeter of blood that we talked about before, instead of it being in the millions, around about 6,000 to 9,000 is the number of white blood cells that you will find in that same quantity of blood. If this number should go up, that would indicate you have an infection. So leukocytes contain no hemoglobin, so that's not their role. They don't possess any definite shape, and the leukocytes have a nucleus during their entire life, and they are also able to move themselves. That doesn't mean they don't circulate with the blood, but if needed, they can move themselves. And their primary function is in immunity. Some of the leukocytes manufacture substances for killing microorganisms, and then their other function is to digest the toxins that might be in the blood to protect you. Now, another type of leukocytes are capable of actually eating large amounts of bacteria. And remember, we called cell eating, we call that phagocytosis. Uh, so these can eat large amounts of bacteria and form material that they might find in the blood and then break them down in their own food vacuoles like we've studied earlier. Now, many of the white blood cells leave the blood vessels through the capillary wall. They can actually move through the capillary wall and into the area of the body where maybe the infection might be. So they aren't stuck inside the blood vessels. They can actually leave through the capillary walls and start waging war against any foreign organism or substance that might be in the body. And in healthy person, the ratio of leukocytes to erythrocytes is about 1 to 600. In other words, 1 leukocyte for every 600 erythrocytes. That's kind of normal when you're healthy. If you have an infection, where you have an invasion of a harmful organism into the body, then that ratio will start to change. And that's what, when they take blood tests and things like that, that's what they're looking for, is what's that ratio. An infection is just, the harmful organism getting into your body, and these leukocytes will also digest and remove the injured and dead body cells. And the accumulation of dead leukocytes, dead organisms that, that were invading our body, and broken cells form a thick fluid that we call pus. So pus is made up of dead leukocytes, dead organisms, and broken down cells. Now, the third major type of cells that we want to talk about are called thrombocytes, or more commonly called platelets. These are cell fragments. They're not actually complete cells. They also lack a nucleus, and they're less than half the size of the erythrocytes. So that's the three black circles that you see here. Those little structures that you can just barely pick out there are called the thrombocytes, or the blood platelets. When you get cut or bruised, the broken blood vessels get plugged by these blood platelets. And the injured tissue releases a chemical that causes these blood platelets to stick to the broken edges of the vessel. And now, blood platelets also release something called serotonin. Some of you have heard that term before. And it causes the smooth muscles of the blood vessel wall to contract. So in other words, they're going to cause the vessel to pinch off to decrease the flow of blood to a small amount, and then hopefully these blood platelets will get stuck in the tiny opening and plug it up, and so that no more blood comes out. So it'll stop the flow of blood from these damaged vessels. So that's kind of the role that they produce, some kind of fibrous-like material that causes the blood to clot. And in that same quantity of blood, you have about 150,000 to 450,000 of these little tiny blood platelets. Now, the process of blood clotting is called coagulation. It's just the formation of a clot. And as you can see in this picture right here, those fibers right there are produced kind of like a cascading series of events. These fibers, or these threads, they're insoluble in the blood, and as you can see, they kind of trap the red blood cells and kind of plug it up, a hole. And these fibers keep the blood from flowing, so it forms actually a blood clot. Now, this is a good time to have a blood clot because you're trying to plug up an opening through which blood has been exiting the body. Now, are there some problems that you can have with clots? And that's probably what more people are familiar with in that discussion, but blood clots are actually a good thing, keep blood from oozing out through holes that have, from an injury or something like that. Now, the process of, or the one term that we use for blood clots is thrombosis. This is going to be a blood clot that forms in an unbroken vessel. In other words, there wasn't an injury that caused this. It was something that happened, and this often happens, it's pretty common like this to happen like in the leg or something like this. If you look at these diagrams down here in the right, in normal blood flow, the red blood cells move through veins in the body. One thing you may be wondering what these things are right here. Your veins actually have valves in them that allow blood only to move toward the heart, not to flow backwards. But inside these, sometimes we can get a blood clot forming, and where you have a whole bunch of blood cells that are bunching together, and they can't get through this opening right here, and so we're going to have a thrombosis, and they prevent the flow of blood. Now, should part of that break off and start moving through the body, floating in the bloodstream, then you have an embolus. So it's just a blood clot that's floating through the bloodstream. Depending on their size, they can be rather dangerous. It can lead to things like a stroke. So if these little tiny blood clots, this embolus, lodges in the cerebral artery that nourishes the brain with blood and oxygen, things like that, then it will cause a stroke. That portion of the brain will will lose oxygen, and remember, the nervous tissue doesn't have an oxygen reserve, and so those cells will begin to die if something isn't corrected. So down here in the series of pictures that they have here, this is what your carotid artery would look like. The carotid is down here in your neck, like just below your jaw. Sometimes you can have a diseased carotid artery, and then it can form a blood clot, and that can start moving up into the other parts of the brain and cutting off blood flow to that portion of the brain. So blood clots can cause that. The other kind of, in addition to stroke that's not listed here, is a heart attack. If this lodges in a portion of one of the important vessels that nourishes the heart, you can have a heart attack. So blood clots are good except in these situations that we've just talked about here. So beginning tomorrow, we're going to start talking about the heart and how it moves blood throughout the body.